Let's get started. Story number one.
I've never been one to believe in urban legends or supernatural stories. I grew up in a small town where the people were practical, grounded. When my friends would talk about ghost sightings, cryptid encounters, or mysterious happenings in the woods, I always nodded politely and laughed it off. I thought I was too smart for that kind of nonsense. I like to think of myself as logical. But that weekend in those woods, I came face to face with something I still don't fully understand. It was the end of October, and the air had started to turn sharp and cold. I had planned a solo camping trip in a secluded area up in the Adirondacks, an area where very few people ventured. I needed to clear my head. Work had been getting to me, and life in general had felt a little too overwhelming. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to feel the kind of peace you can only find when you're deep in the forest, miles from anyone. I drove up Friday morning, taking the winding roads that led deeper into the woods. I'd been here before, many times. It was a place I knew well. The trailhead was easy to find, and the hike wasn't difficult. My pack wasn't heavy, and the weather was perfect for an October hike. The kind of hike you think you'll look back on and remember fondly. After about 2 hours of hiking, I arrived at the spot I'd chosen to camp, a little clearing beside a small creek. The sound of the water was soothing, and I quickly set up camp. It wasn't the first time I'd camped by myself, so setting up the tent and getting the fire started was second nature. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, I settled in by the fire, enjoying the solitude. I had a few books to read, but mostly I just stared into the flames, listening to the sounds of the forest. There's something so calming about the woods at dusk, the crickets chirping, the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like the world was at peace. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and rice, washed it down with a bottle of water, and decided to turn in early. The fire crackled as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, ready to let the exhaustion from the hike wash over me. I woke up later to an unsettling sound. At first, I thought it was a dream, the kind of thing that happens when you're half awake in the dark. But the sound persisted, a faint crunching, like someone walking through the leaves. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, moving through the woods. But then I realized it was too deliberate, too human. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise was close, too close. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the sound stopped. There was only silence. I sat up in my tent, heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal, or maybe the wind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Minutes passed, maybe more. I don't know. Time felt suspended. Then I heard it again, this time louder. Footsteps, slow and measured, moving around my camp. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My heart was racing, and I knew I should do something. But fear kept me paralyzed. The footsteps continued, circling my tent. I could hear the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. Whoever it was walking deliberately, almost methodically, like they knew I was inside. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. The footsteps stopped just as suddenly as they had started. I didn't dare move. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was a hunter? I had heard about people getting lost in the woods, or hikers wandering off trail. But it didn't feel right. There was something about it that made my stomach twist. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to unzip the tent just a little, enough to peek outside. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing. Nothing but trees, the faint glow of my campfire, and the heavy silence of the woods. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, waiting for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Reluctantly, I crawled back into my sleeping bag, my eyes wide open, listening for any sound. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I hardly slept. My mind kept playing tricks on me. Every rustle of a leaf, every shift in the wind made me jump. I kept my flashlight beside me and the knife in my hand, just in case. The morning was cold, crisp, and silent. The sun was just starting to rise when I finally unzipped the tent, my nerves still on edge. The first thing I noticed was that my camp had been disturbed. My fire pit was gone. Somehow, the rocks that had formed the circle around my fire were scattered, the ashes overturned. My gear had been moved. Not much, just a few things. A pot and my pack had been shifted as if someone had been looking through them. I didn't know what to make of it. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but the logical part of me said that maybe it was an animal, something trying to get to my food. I didn't feel like I was in immediate danger, so I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I tried to push it down, telling myself I was overreacting, that I was just paranoid. I spent most of the morning hiking around, exploring a few of the nearby trails, but as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, that feeling of unease returned. The air had started to grow heavier, colder. The woods seemed to grow quieter too, as if something had changed. I decided to go back to camp and start preparing for the night. When I reached my campsite, I was stunned by what I saw. My tent had been moved. It wasn't where I had left it. It had been dragged a few feet away, as though someone had deliberately shifted it. The fire pit was disturbed again, and this time there were footprints, fresh ones, leading away from my camp and into the trees. I don't know why I didn't leave then. I guess I was in shock. The idea that someone had been watching me, had been toying with me, felt surreal. I kept trying to tell myself that there was some reasonable explanation, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire, watching the shadows dance around me. Every noise made my heart race. Every creak of a branch, every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind. As the hours passed, the silence became almost oppressive. It was as if the woods were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know when it was, but at some point, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they weren't just circling my camp. They were heading straight toward me. The sound was heavy, deliberate, and unmistakable. Someone or something was coming for me. I grabbed my backpack and started running, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I had to get out. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran deeper into the woods until the world around me blurred. I don't remember how long I ran. It felt like hours. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. Eventually, I collapsed out of breath in a small hollow near a stream. My mind was racing, my chest heaving as I tried to calm myself. I don't know how long I lay there, but at some point, I heard it again. The footsteps. Slow. Measured. But this time, they were farther away. And then they stopped. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. I eventually made my way back to the trailhead, and after what felt like a lifetime, I found my car. I drove home that night, not stopping until I was safely back in my apartment. I never went back to those woods. To this day, I still don't know who or what was following me that weekend. I don't know if it was a person or something else, but the fear I felt, the sense of being hunted, is something I will never forget. Story the end.
Story number 2.
It started with a plan for solitude. I'd been burned out from work, overwhelmed by people, and desperate for quiet. I'd always loved the woods. As a kid, I used to go on long hikes with my dad, and we'd talk about nothing in particular, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the rustle of birds in the canopy above. So I figured a few nights alone in the forest would be good for my head. I chose a national forest I'd been to once before, years ago, and picked a section far off the beaten path. The ranger station gave me a permit, asked me if I had a GPS, and warned me about bears. I nodded through all of it, told them I had the essentials, and left with a map marked in pencil where I was allowed to camp. I parked the car on the dirt road near the edge of the forest and started hiking around noon. The first hour was uneventful. There was a breeze, the sun filtering through the trees, and the comforting scent of damp soil. I took my time, stopping every now and then to listen. I didn't realize how much noise modern life made until I stood there hearing nothing but the distant sound of birds and the wind brushing against the treetops. I set up camp next to a small creek just before sunset. My one-person tent sat a few yards from the water, far enough not to get wet if it rained. I made a small fire, boiled water, ate some freeze-dried food, and settled in as the sky dimmed. The fire popped and cracked, and I watched the orange glow flicker across the trees. That first night was uneventful, but I couldn't sleep. I wasn't scared, just hyper-aware. Every creak of a branch, every distant snap made my ears perk up. Once, I thought I heard breathing just beyond the trees. but it faded, probably the wind or an animal. Eventually, I dozed off. The next morning, I brewed some instant coffee, stretched, and started exploring. I left the tent and gear where it was, figuring I'd make a loop and be back by early afternoon. The forest was beautiful. No trails, no other campers, just untouched wilderness. I walked for maybe an hour and came across something that made me stop. It was a pile of stones, 5 or 6 of them, smooth and round, stacked neatly in a small clearing. They weren't natural. Someone had clearly arranged them. At first, I thought it might be an old trail marker, but it didn't match any I'd seen before. I crouched down and noticed something etched into the largest stone. It looked like a symbol, 2 intersecting triangles with a circle in the middle. Faint, but there. I felt weird, like I'd stumbled onto something private. I stood up, took a picture with my phone just in case, and turned to head back. But as I walked, something felt off. I knew the general direction I'd come from, but the trees looked unfamiliar. I told myself not to panic. I had a GPS in my backpack back at the tent, and I could always follow the creek downstream if I had to. Still, I picked up the pace. I didn't find the creek. After another hour, I sat down on a fallen log, wiped sweat off my forehead, and tried to retrace my steps in my head. I pulled out my phone and turned it on. No signal, but the battery still had about 80%. I opened the compass app and tried to orient myself south toward where I thought the camp was. I started walking again and eventually saw something through the trees. Canvas. Relief washed over me. I pushed through some underbrush and found a tent. But not mine. It was older, a faded green dome-style tent, half collapsed, covered in pine needles and leaves. No one was around. I called out instinctively. No answer. I should have turned around right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled back the flap and looked inside. There was a sleeping bag, half-zipped, and a small pile of rotted clothes. Jeans, a flannel shirt. Everything was damp and smelled musty, but it didn't look like it had been there for decades, just abandoned long enough to decay. A small notebook lay next to the sleeping bag. I took it out and flipped through it. The pages were warped, ink bleeding in some places, but I could make out a few entries. Day 2 heard something last night. Not an animal. Too quiet. It just stood there outside the tent. I didn't move. Day 4. Saw the rocks again. The symbol wasn't there before. Day 6. The forest keeps changing. I'm not walking in circles, but I keep ending up in the same place. Day 7. There's something out here with me. I stopped reading. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank, maybe a weird art project, but the paper was aged and the handwriting changed slightly, like the person had gotten more panicked with each entry. I folded the notebook and shoved it into my pack. I didn't want to stay there. I didn't want to even look at that tent anymore. I picked a direction and walked fast, ignoring the compass, just following my instinct now. Eventually, I heard the creek again. Relief poured through me. I jogged toward the sound and followed it upstream, hoping it would lead me back. After what felt like another mile, I spotted the edge of my camp. I should have felt better, but something was wrong. I knew it immediately. The fire pit looked undisturbed. The tent still zipped, but I noticed my mug had moved. It was sitting on a rock several feet away. I never left it there. I approached slowly. Everything inside the tent looked normal. My bag, sleeping pad, food, nothing was missing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, watching. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat inside the tent with my knife in my hand, listening. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps. They were soft, slow, crunching in the underbrush. They stopped just outside the tent. I held my breath. No animal moves like that. It wasn't sniffing or digging. It was standing, waiting. I stayed completely still. Minutes passed. Then, a low breath. Not mine, not from inside. It was right outside the nylon wall. Just one slow exhale, then silence. I don't know how long I stayed frozen. I didn't sleep. When the sky began to lighten, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out. Nothing was there. No footprints, nothing disturbed. But I didn't care. I packed everything fast. I was done. I started following the creek down, hoping it would lead me to a main trail or at least something familiar. The forest was different that morning, quieter somehow, oppressive, like the trees were watching. After 2 hours of walking, I came across another clearing. My heart dropped. The same stones were there, same arrangement, same symbol. This wasn't possible. I had gone the opposite direction. I looked around. Nothing made sense. I turned and started walking faster, trying not to let panic take over. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing between two trees, maybe 50 yards away, human-shaped. Still. I froze. I blinked. Gone. Gone. I kept moving. I didn't care if I was going in circles anymore. I just wanted out. By late afternoon, my legs ached and my water was low. I sat down for a minute to rest, and that's when I heard it. A voice. Faint, distant, calling my name. Eric. I stood up fast. No one knew where I was. I hadn't told anyone the exact area, just the general forest. The voice came again. Eric! It didn't sound right. It sounded like someone pretending to be human. I didn't answer. I just walked, faster now, almost running, tripping over roots and rocks. By evening, I found the dirt road. I almost cried. My car was just where I left it, dusty but untouched. I threw my bag in the back seat, got in, and didn't look back. I drove for hours without stopping, not even when I hit paved road. I didn't feel safe until I was halfway home. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I took out the notebook I found in that old tent. I flipped to the last page. It was dated only a few weeks ago. The last line read, "If you see the stones again, it's already too late." I burned the notebook in a metal trash can behind the station. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. I only know that something was out there. Something old, watching, patient. I never went back. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I don't usually tell this story. It's the kind of thing that people either don't believe or they get weird about afterward, like I've got some kind of darkness clinging to me. But I'll tell you because I haven't stopped thinking about it, not once since it happened. Maybe putting it down in words will finally shut it up in my head. This was 4 years ago. I was 27, single, working remote freelance contracts in graphic design. I like to unplug once in a while. Really unplug. No phone, no laptop, no Wi-Fi. Just trees and silence. I'd done plenty of solo hiking and camping trips before. Nothing hardcore, just me, a backpack, a tent, and a few days off the grid. That October, I picked a place I hadn't been to before. It was a patch of dense forest land in northern Pennsylvania, not a state park or anything official, just old, empty woods you could access if you knew where to park and how to follow a topo map. I'd found it through a combination of trail forums and dumb luck. According to a few posts, it was remote but beautiful, with an old overgrown logging road you could follow to find flat spots to camp on. I drove up from Philly and got to the trailhead around noon on a Friday. My plan was to hike in about 5 miles, camp for 2 nights, then hike out Sunday morning. The air had that cold, crisp bite to it. Dead leaves and pine needles softened the trail. I passed no one, just quiet, peaceful. I made it to a nice clearing around 4, pitched my tent, and made dinner over a little portable stove. I read by flashlight for a bit and crawled into my sleeping bag early. No fire, too dry, and I wasn't taking chances. The first night was uneventful, at least at first. I fell asleep to the sounds of wind through the trees and the occasional owl. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to a noise. It was distant, crunching. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe a bear, moving through the brush, but it didn't sound like any 4-legged animal I've ever heard. The steps were too measured. 2 feet. Long pauses between them. A few steps, then stillness. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening as the sound came a little closer. It was maybe 100 yards out, just barely within earshot. Then it stopped. I laid awake for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I must have dozed off again because the next thing I remember is waking up to sunlight pushing through the tent walls. I told myself it was a hunter. Probably someone out early. Not many people came out this far, but it wasn't impossible. Saturday morning passed uneventfully. I made oatmeal, did some sketching in my notebook, and explored a nearby stream. I didn't see or hear anything else out of place. By late afternoon, a fog had crept in. Not unusual for October. Still, it made everything feel a little more closed in. That night, I built a small fire in a makeshift ring I made with stones, just enough for some warmth. I stayed up a little later, had a nip of whiskey, and watched the flames until I felt sleepy. I woke up again around 2. This time, I knew I wasn't dreaming. Something was outside my tent. It was standing just beyond the thin nylon walls. I could hear breathing. Not animal breathing, but something controlled. Inhalations and exhalations. Steady. Then a shuffle. and something touched the side of the tent, lightly, like a finger dragging along the fabric. I sat up slowly in my sleeping bag, heart pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I reached for the small knife I kept in the side pocket of my backpack, barely daring to make a sound. I didn't have a gun. Never thought I'd need one. This was supposed to be solitude, not survival. Another shuffle. Then it was gone. No footsteps leading away, no sound of breaking twigs or rustling brush. Just gone. I stayed frozen for a long time, maybe an hour. Eventually, I opened the zipper just an inch and peeked out with my flashlight. The beam cut through fog and hit nothing but trees and shadows. In the morning, I found prints. Human. Bare feet. The forest floor was soft with moss and wet leaves, and there they were, clear as day. A single pair, leading from the trees up to the side of my tent, then stopping. No return trail. No detour. Just an arrival. I didn't eat breakfast. I broke down my camp in 10 minutes, barely able to keep my hands steady. I should have hiked straight out, but my panic worked against logic. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was tired, stressed, maybe even had a waking dream. I moved a half-mile deeper instead. Stupid, I know. I thought maybe if someone was messing with me, some hick or backwoods squatter, I could lose them if I moved. So I hiked until I found a thicket, crouched low, and set up again. No open clearings this time. Just trees. The canopy above blocked out most of the sunlight. Everything felt tighter. I didn't light a fire, didn't make dinner. I stayed inside the tent with my knife and flashlight and waited for night. It didn't take long. This time I heard it around midnight. Not just footsteps, but something else. Mimicking. It started with a whistle, 2 notes. Low, then high. Repeated again. It wasn't a bird. It didn't vary. It sounded like someone trying to sound like a bird. I shut off my flashlight and curled into a ball, blade in hand, ears straining. Then I heard it again. Hello? It was my voice. That was what made my stomach drop. The exact inflection, like a recording played back. It had that eerie echo, like someone imitating me with just enough wrong to make it deeply unsettling. Hello? Again, the same pitch, the same pause. Something was mocking me. And then laughter, childlike, thin and choked, bubbling up from somewhere in the dark. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. Just enough for me to know I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. The sounds eventually stopped, but I couldn't bring myself to open the tent again until the sky turned gray. That morning, I packed up and left everything I didn't need behind. Tent, stove, all of it. I threw my pack on and began power walking back the way I came. I checked my compass every few minutes. I didn't want to get lost. About an hour into the hike, I started noticing marks on the trees. Carvings. At first, I thought they were just natural damage, bark peeled away by animals or storms. But then I saw one up close. It was a crude symbol. A circle with an X through it, etched deeply into the trunk. Then another, and another. The marks grew fresher the further I went. Some looked like they'd been carved just hours earlier. Wood still pale and moist. And then I saw my name. Not my full name. Just the first letter and last name, scrawled like a signature on the base of a tree. My last name isn't common. No way it was coincidence. I started running. I didn't care if I fell or broke my ankle. I just wanted to be out. I sprinted until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. I kept expecting to see someone in the woods, waiting, bare feet, pale face, watching. But I didn't see anyone. When I reached my car, I practically dove into it, locked every door, and didn't stop driving until I hit the first town I could find. I slept that night in a parking lot outside a gas station, afraid to check into a motel. For weeks after, I had dreams. Not quite nightmares, more like echoes, whistles, footsteps, laughter. I'd wake up gasping, knife still under my pillow, drenched in sweat. Eventually, I stopped camping alone. Then I stopped hiking altogether. Now I live in the city. I don't go anywhere I can't see buildings or people. I told a park ranger friend about it once. He didn't laugh, just nodded and said, "There's places people aren't meant to go alone." I asked if he thought it was someone playing games. He said maybe. But then he told me something that still gives me chills. He said sometimes when people disappear out there, we don't find tracks going out, just in. Story the end.
Story number 4.
I've always been someone who craved solitude. Not the fleeting kind you get during a lunch break, but real, bone-deep silence. The kind that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. I work in graphic design and spend most of my time in a small windowless office surrounded by humming computers and fluorescent lights. The constant buzz of city life had started to rot something inside me. So when I got the opportunity to take a week off, I rented a small cabin in the Adirondacks. I didn't want anything fancy, just a place far from the nearest road where I could think, walk, and maybe remember what it felt like to breathe. The cabin was a recommendation from a coworker who knew someone, a kind of under-the-radar rental. No website, no address on Google Maps, just GPS coordinates and a metal key mailed to me in a plain envelope. I should have thought more about how strange that was, but at the time, it felt charming, like a secret, something untouched by the chaos of modern life. I packed light, a backpack with clothes, a few meals worth of dehydrated food, a first aid kit, my Kindle, a small hatchet, a flashlight, and a hand-cranked radio. I didn't expect to need much. The cabin was supposed to be stocked with basics: firewood, water from a nearby stream, a cot and blankets. No electricity, no plumbing. Exactly what I wanted. I left my car about 5 miles from the cabin. That was as close as the road would take me. The rest was a hike along an old logging trail, mostly overgrown, but still passable. The air grew colder the deeper I went, the sunlight filtering through pine branches in thin, tired shafts. My boots crunched softly on the trail, and I felt the weight of the world fall off my shoulders as I moved away from civilization. It took me about 2 hours to reach the cabin. It was smaller than I expected, tucked between two massive boulders and half swallowed by the forest. Moss crept up the sides of the wood, and the windows were covered in grime. But it looked sturdy, the kind of place built to endure. Inside, it was sparse but serviceable. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner with a neat stack of firewood beside it, a table and single chair, some dusty shelves with a few cans of beans and bottles of iodine. The cot had a heavy wool blanket folded neatly at the foot. I opened the shutters and let the light in. I spent the first day just walking around the area, familiarizing myself with the terrain. There was a narrow stream not far from the cabin where the water ran cold and clear. I filled a jug and treated it with purification tablets. Birds chirped overhead, and once I spotted a fox darting between the trees. It felt like I had slipped into a postcard. That night, I built a fire and sat outside under the stars. The silence was astonishing. Not just the absence of people, but the absence of anything artificial. No cars in the distance, no buzzing power lines, no hum of electronics, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I went to bed that night feeling cleaner than I had in years. It was the second night when things began to feel off. I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. The air was colder than it should have been, and the cabin had gone deathly silent. No wind, no insects, just a strange stillness. I sat up and listened, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. A soft thump, like a footfall, just one. I held my breath. Another. This time closer. The sound came from behind the cabin. There was no path back there, just thick brush and trees. I crept to the window and peeked out, but it was too dark to see anything. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and swept it slowly across the tree line. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, straining my ears. After several minutes of silence, I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I got back into bed, but didn't sleep much. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was soft from a light rain the day before, and I figured if something had been out there, it would have left prints. It did. A single set of footprints, bare, human, led from the tree line to the rear wall of the cabin and then stopped. No prints leading away, no signs of disturbance, just a trail that ended inches from the wood. I stared at them for a long time. They were narrow and long, with toes that dug slightly into the mud. I thought maybe some hiker got lost, came through the woods, and then turned around, but there were no exit tracks, nothing but those bare feet approaching and stopping. I went back inside and locked the door. That day, I didn't hike. I stayed close, chopping some wood, reading by the fire, trying to convince myself it was all just something easily explained. That night, the knocking started. It was just after midnight. I had dozed off in the chair by the fire when I heard it. 3 slow knocks on the wall to my left. Not the door, the wall. I sat bolt upright, heart thundering in my chest. The fire was low, casting flickering shadows across the floor. Knock, 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 again. This time on the opposite wall. I grabbed the axe and stood, unsure what to do. I didn't have a phone, no way to call for help. I considered going outside, but every instinct told me not to open that door. Then it stopped. I stayed awake until sunrise, gripping the axe, flinching at every creak and groan of the old cabin. In the morning, I found more footprints. This time they were on every side of the cabin, circling it. Still barefoot. Still no sign of departure. I packed my things. I didn't care how long the hike was. I wasn't staying another night. But when I stepped outside, the path was gone. Not overgrown. Not hidden. Gone. The trail I had taken to get here, the one I had walked easily, clearly marked by broken twigs and boot prints, had vanished. In its place were unbroken ferns, untouched earth, and trees I didn't recognize. I tried to retrace my steps. I even used my compass, certain I was going the right direction. But after an hour of walking, I ended up back at the cabin. I don't remember turning around. The sun dipped lower. I started marking trees with my hatchet. Long slashes, clear and unmistakable. I followed a straight line, cutting as I went. But as I walked, I began to see the same markings again and again, the exact same ones, the same knot in the bark, the same bent branch. It was as if I were moving in circles, even though I never turned. I ran for a while, trying to break whatever loop I was trapped in, but the forest never changed. Eventually, I gave up and returned to the cabin. That night, the whispers started. They came just after dark. At first, they were so faint I thought it was the wind, but then I began to hear words, though not in any language I knew. It sounded wet, gurgling, like voices speaking through a mouthful of water. They moved around the cabin, one moment near the door, the next outside the window. I stayed in the center of the room, flashlight in one hand, axe in the other. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. I didn't dare put it out. At one point, something pressed against the window. Just a shape, not a face, not a hand, just pressure. A dark bulge in the glass, like the wood was bending inward. Then came the breathing. It started above me, on the roof, heavy, labored. Each inhale a wet rattle, each exhale a whistle. Then footsteps. Something pacing above me, dragging what sounded like claws or nails across the shingles. It stayed there for hours. At dawn, everything stopped, like a switch had been flipped. The forest returned to its normal self, chirping birds, swaying trees, soft wind. I went outside and found new marks, symbols, carved into the trees around the cabin, circles, eyes, strange runes that hurt to look at. Some had fresh sap leaking from them as if they'd been cut only minutes before. I spent the day writing in a notebook, trying to document everything. I thought if I left a record, maybe someone would find it, maybe it would make sense later. That night I didn't light the fire. I didn't want them to see me. But they came anyway. This time, there were voices. Loud, mocking, high-pitched, and low. Dozens of them. Maybe more. They spoke my name, not shouted, whispered, over and over. They begged me to come outside. They told me they were cold. They told me I was chosen. Something tapped the door lightly, then again, then harder, until the wood began to splinter. I screamed. I swung the axe at nothing. I screamed again. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember anything after that moment. When I opened my eyes, it was bright and quiet. A ranger stood over me, shaking my shoulder. He said a helicopter pilot had seen smoke and reported it. It took them a day to reach the cabin. They found me lying in front of the fireplace, surrounded by ash. There was no trail, no symbols, no footprints, nothing but an old cabin and a man nearly delirious with fear. I never went back. I never told the full story. But sometimes when it's quiet, when I'm alone, I still hear the knocking, and I know they remember me. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I had always been drawn to the idea of isolation. Ever since I was a child, I loved the notion of getting away from everything, of finding a spot where no one could reach me. It wasn't the kind of isolation that came with being lonely. It was the kind that let you breathe and think and exist without the constant hum of civilization pressing in on you. When I turned 30, I finally decided to take a week off and experience true solitude. I didn't want a fancy cabin or a glamping site. I wanted to be deep in the woods with no phone service, no internet, and no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of nature. I rented a small rustic cabin in the remote wilderness of the Cascades. It was far enough off the beaten path that the only way to reach it was by a narrow, overgrown trail. The kind of place where you wouldn't find another soul for miles. The cabin's owner, an older man named Bert, told me that it was perfect for getting away from everything. He even warned me to make sure I had everything I needed because the nearest town was a few hours away. It didn't bother me. I loved the idea of complete seclusion. The first couple of days went by as I'd expected. I arrived at the cabin in the early afternoon, unpacked my bags, and explored the surrounding forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of the wind through the trees. I'd packed a few books, a journal, and some simple food to get by for the week. I didn't plan on doing much other than hiking, reading, and writing. On the second day, I decided to venture deeper into the woods. The trail outside the cabin was faint, but I followed it as it wound through dense trees and over small streams. The further I went, the more I realized how easy it was to get lost in the wilderness. The forest was thick, and the canopy overhead blocked out much of the sun. The trail became more difficult to follow, and I had to pay close attention to my surroundings to avoid losing my way. After a few hours of hiking, I realized that I had wandered much further than I intended. I stopped for a moment, looking around to get my bearings. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like a twig snapping underfoot, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It was probably just an animal. A deer, maybe. Or the wind playing tricks on me. But the sound came again, this time closer. A soft crunch of leaves underfoot, like something or someone was moving through the forest. I stood completely still, like my senses on high alert, but I couldn't see anything. I was certain someone or something was out there. My mind raced, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I started walking again, picking up the pace. The sound followed, just behind me, but every time I stopped, it stopped. It was like whatever it was mimicking my movements. I finally turned around, ready to confront whatever was there, but again, there was nothing. Just the same dense forest surrounding me. My heart was racing now, and I could feel a chill running through my bones. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself down. I was just being paranoid. After all, I was in the woods. There were bound to be animals, and the occasional sound could easily be explained. I turned back and hurried towards the cabin. I didn't want to stay out there any longer than I had to. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the trees. But there was nothing. I made it back to the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. I locked the door behind me, trying to shake the feeling that I was being followed. But it lingered. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than usual, and I couldn't help but feel that I wasn't alone. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I did some chores around the property, chopping wood, organizing the small stack of supplies Bert had left me, and tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But by late afternoon, I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to take a walk down by the stream to clear my head. As I walked along the bank, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the mud, leading away from the water and into the trees. The tracks were strange. The shape was human, but they were far too large, and they looked wrong. There was no distinct arch to the foot, no clear outline of toes. It was as if something with an oversized, misshapen foot had been walking along the stream. I followed the tracks, my curiosity getting the better of me, but as I moved deeper into the woods, the air grew heavier, and the feeling of being watched returned. I stopped when I saw the next set of footprints. This one was different. Instead of leading away from the water, it seemed to circle back towards it. The tracks grew fainter as if they had been made some time ago, but something about them felt intentional, like someone or something had been trying to leave a trail for me to find. My heart started racing, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I had no idea what was going on, but I didn't want to find out. I turned and headed back towards the cabin, my pace quickening as I went. That night, I heard the knocking. It was soft at first, a gentle tapping against the door. I froze, unsure if I had heard it correctly. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if someone was gently tapping on the wood with their knuckles. I grabbed the flashlight and crept over to the door, peering out through the small crack in the wood. Nothing. I stepped back, my mind racing. Who could it be? There were no other cabins around for miles, no other houses for miles. I was completely alone out there. The knocking continued, persistent and rhythmic. Tap, 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 tap. I took a step back, heart pounding. I had to know who or what was out there. I opened the door just a crack, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness outside. The beam bounced off nothing but trees and shadows. There was no one there. The knocking stopped as soon as I opened the door, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I stepped outside, the night air cold against my skin, and scanned the area around me. But I saw nothing. I was about to close the door when I noticed something strange. Just inside the threshold in the dirt was a small pile of twigs. They were arranged in a perfect circle, the ends facing inward, as though someone had placed them there on purpose. My stomach dropped. There was no wind, no reason for the twigs to be arranged in such a way. The air felt thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. A sense of dread washed over me. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, wide awake, waiting for something to happen. But nothing came. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I wasn't safe. I packed up my things, grabbing everything I could in a hurried frenzy, and prepared to leave. I figured I would hike out early, reach the nearest town, and try to make sense of everything later. But as I gathered my belongings, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cabin door was wide open. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I slowly approached the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to leave while I still could. But I couldn't. I had to know. I stepped outside and scanned the area. The woods were silent, as if they were holding their breath. And then, as I turned back to the cabin, I saw it, more twigs. A ring of them, arranged carefully around the cabin, forming a perfect circle, a warning, or a trap. I grabbed my backpack and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing truck. The driver didn't ask questions. I think he could see the panic in my eyes. He drove me straight to the nearest town, where I immediately booked a room at a motel. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods. I don't know what the footprints meant, or who had been knocking on my door, or what those twigs were supposed to signify. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to those woods again. There's something in there. Something that watches and waits. Something that doesn't want you to leave. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The sun was already low by the time I realized I was off trail. I had been hiking since morning, following the markers along the Pine Hollow Trail, feeling good about the cool fall air and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I had a weekend to myself, no work emails, no meetings, no obligations, just me, my backpack, and the woods. But I'd gotten too confident. Somewhere after the second ridge, the markers disappeared, or maybe I missed them. Either way, by the time I noticed the landscape around me wasn't matching the map, it was too late to turn back. I wasn't panicking yet. I'd brought plenty of supplies, water, food, emergency gear. I had a basic compass and the general knowledge that heading west would eventually get me closer to the road. But the woods seemed thicker here, wilder. The trees older and gnarled, their branches twisted like arthritic fingers clawing at the sky. There was an oppressive hush in the air, too, like the woods were holding their breath. I pressed on, glancing at the compass every few minutes. The sun finally sank below the trees, casting everything in deep blue shadow. I had about half an hour before total darkness. I picked a flat patch near a rocky outcrop to set up camp. No sense stumbling around in the dark. By the time the tent was pitched and a small fire was crackling, night had completely fallen. I sat close to the flames, eating a protein bar and sipping water, trying to shake the gnawing unease building in my gut. It was too quiet. No crickets, no frogs, not even the occasional hoot of an owl. Just the fire popping and my own breathing. I told myself it was normal. Some parts of the forest go silent at night. Predators on the move, maybe. Natural cycles, nothing to worry about. Still, I slept with my knife tucked into the side pocket of my sleeping bag. Somewhere deep into the night, I woke up. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was the feeling of being watched. My heart pounded as I lay there, frozen. I strained my ears, hearing nothing but the faint crackle of the dying fire. Then, just barely, I heard it, a shuffle. A slow, deliberate scraping against the forest floor, too heavy to be a raccoon or a fox, maybe a bear. I tightened my grip on the knife. The shuffling came closer, circling the tent. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I listened as it circled once, twice, then a soft, almost inaudible sniffing sound, like something trying to catch my scent. The fire cast flickering shadows against the tent walls, making it impossible to tell if something was moving outside. Minutes dragged by. Then the sounds receded, the shuffling and sniffing fading into the trees. I lay awake until the first weak light of dawn bled into the tent. When I finally stepped outside, the forest looked perfectly normal. Damp leaves, gray light, a few scattered crows cawing in the distance. But around my tent the leaves were disturbed, trampled down by something large, and near the fire pit, half buried under a scattering of ash, was something small and white. I picked it up. A tooth. Human or close enough. I dropped it immediately, heart hammering against my ribs. I packed up in record time, deciding that west wasn't good enough anymore. I needed to find the trail or at least a road, and fast. I picked a direction and moved quickly, keeping my eyes scanning for anything familiar. The deeper into the woods I went, the stranger it became. Trees leaned at odd angles, their trunks scarred with deep gouges. Some looked almost like claw marks. Patches of ground were churned up as if something massive had passed through, tearing the earth. More unsettling were the things I started finding. Old pieces of clothing, half-buried shoes, a tattered jacket caught on a branch, a shredded backpack lying at the base of a tree. I didn't investigate them closely. I didn't want to. Around midday, I stumbled onto what looked like a trail. It was rough, overgrown, and clearly not maintained, but it was better than nothing. I followed it, keeping my pace brisk but quiet, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The feeling of being watched had returned, heavier now, like a hand pressing down on the back of my neck. After an hour or two, I heard something behind me. At first, it was just twigs snapping, normal enough, but then it grew louder, a deliberate crashing through the undergrowth. It wasn't a deer or a bear. It was too deliberate, too slow, like something large and cautious trying to follow without being seen. I didn't stop to look. I ran. The trail twisted and turned, vanishing and reappearing through patches of thorny brush. Branches clawed at my jacket and face, ripping the skin. My lungs burned. I could hear it behind me now, closer, moving faster. Not running, but striding with heavy, deliberate steps. Ahead, the trail opened into a clearing. I burst out of the trees and stumbled to a halt. The clearing was filled with bones. Animal bones, mostly. Deer, raccoon, maybe a bear. But scattered among them were bones that looked all too human. Skulls with hollow eye sockets, ribs snapped like twigs, femurs gnawed and splintered. In the center of the clearing stood a massive oak tree. Hanging from its lower branches were more things. Shreds of clothing, bits of rope, something that might have been a backpack at one point. And at the base of the tree was a hole. Not a natural sinkhole or erosion pit. This was deliberate. A perfect circle, maybe 6 feet across, descending into blackness. The edges were lined with crude hand-dug steps, slick with mud. Something moved at the bottom. I couldn't see it clearly, just the suggestion of motion in the darkness. Behind me, the trees exploded in noise. Heavy footsteps, crashing branches. Without thinking, I bolted across the clearing, skirting the edge of the bone pile. I plunged back into the woods, branches whipping against me, adrenaline drowning out everything else. I don't know how long I ran. Time blurred into a haze of terror and exhaustion. Eventually, I saw a flash of color through the trees, blue and white, a trail marker. I stumbled toward it, gasping, nearly sobbing with relief. It was the Pine Hollow Trail. I wasn't far from the parking lot. I forced myself to keep moving, even as every muscle screamed in protest. The footsteps behind me faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the lot, I collapsed against my car, fumbling the keys from my pocket with shaking hands. I didn't look back until I was inside. Doors locked, engine roaring to life. Standing just at the edge of the trees was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over bone, its face pale and eyeless. Its mouth hung open in a slack, soundless scream. It raised one long, skeletal hand and pointed at me. I didn't stay to see what it would do next. I drove without stopping until I reached the nearest town, a nameless cluster of buildings hours away. I didn't sleep that night or the next. I tried to tell people, rangers, police, even a journalist I found online who wrote about disappearances in national parks. They all nodded politely, said they'd look into it, but nothing ever came of it. Sometimes when I'm alone, I can still hear the footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that hole, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 7.
I grew up in Vermont where the woods are thick and the winters long. Being outdoors was a second nature to me. I spent more time in the trees than inside any building. So when I decided to take a solo camping trip in October 2021, it didn't seem unusual or reckless. I wanted to get away for a few days, unplug, and be alone with my thoughts. I chose an area about 30 miles outside of Montpelier. Not a state park or any managed land, just deep forest, private property that belonged to a friend's family. They hadn't used it in years, but it was still technically theirs. They gave me the green light to pitch a tent wherever I wanted. No trails, no facilities, no other people. Exactly what I wanted. The first day was gorgeous. Crisp air, leaves bright red and orange under a sharp blue sky. I hiked in maybe 6 miles, set up camp by a small clearing surrounded by tall maples. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, the stream nearby clear and cold. After setting up my tent and gathering firewood, I built a fire, cooked some canned chili, and sat by the flames until night fell. The stars were unbelievable, that far from civilization. I remember thinking it was almost too quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat if I listened hard enough. But I liked it. I slept deep that first night, lulled by the sounds of distant owls and the wind in the trees. The second day was colder. The kind of damp cold that gets into your bones, even if the temperature isn't technically freezing yet. I hiked a few miles around the area, not following a path, but generally keeping track of my direction with a compass and landmarks. I saw deer prints, raccoon tracks, even what I thought was a bear print. Pretty common in Vermont. Nothing I wasn't used to. Late in the afternoon, though, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. Just a sensation. I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I brushed it off as nerves. When you're alone that deep in the woods, your mind can play tricks on you. I told myself that. I got back to camp before dark, made a fire, and heated up some soup. I was halfway through eating when I heard a twig snap beyond the trees. Not the distant crack of a falling branch. Close. Deliberate. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. Another snap, slightly to the left this time, like something moving, circling the camp. I stood up, grabbed the hatchet I'd used to chop wood, and called out, "Hello?" No answer. The forest was dead silent now. No wind. No owls. No insects. I told myself it could be a deer, or maybe even a bear. I made a lot of noise, shouting, clanging my metal cup against a rock, trying to scare it off. After a few minutes with no more sounds, I cautiously sat back down by the fire. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every few minutes I thought I heard faint footsteps. Sometimes to the left, sometimes behind the tent. Once it sounded like they were right outside the thin nylon wall. I lay there clutching the hatchet, heart pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Morning couldn't come fast enough. I debated packing up and heading back to the car, but my pride got the better of me. I told myself again that it was just my imagination. I hadn't seen anything, hadn't heard any animal noises, no growls or snorts, probably a raccoon or some other small animal. Still, I moved my camp that day, a good 2 miles north. I found a new clearing, closer to a rocky hill that I thought might offer some protection. Setting up the second camp, I found something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the bark of a tree at the edge of the clearing was a crude drawing. A stick figure. But not just any stick figure. It was surrounded by dozens of smaller stick figures, and all of them had X's for eyes. And the central figure? It had a wide, jagged smile carved all the way across its face. It didn't look old. The cuts were fresh, saps still weeping from the grooves. I stared at it for a long time, the hair on the back of my neck standing straight up. I told myself it was just some hunter's joke. Maybe some teenagers had come through recently, messing around. It didn't mean anything, but it felt like a warning. I built my fire high that night, keeping it roaring as long as I could. I sat close to it, hatchet in my lap, flashlight nearby. Every few minutes I shone the light into the trees, but the beam only went so far, swallowed by the darkness. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they didn't try to be quiet. Slow, deliberate steps just beyond the light of the fire, crunching leaves, breaking small twigs. I called out again, voice shaking, "Who's there?" Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it around. For just a second, I thought I caught a glimpse of something, someone, standing between two trees. Pale, thin, motionless. When the beam hit them, they stepped back into the shadows. I didn't sleep at all that night. At first light, I packed up everything, barely taking time to eat. I wanted out. I didn't care if it meant hiking the full 8 miles without stopping. I just needed to get back to the car. The hike back was a nightmare. No matter how fast I walked, I kept hearing footsteps behind me. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. I never saw anything when I turned around, but the sense of being watched was unbearable. I started talking out loud, trying to keep myself calm. At one point, I started singing just to hear something human. And then I heard it, a second voice, soft, whispering the same words I was saying, just half a beat behind. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but I stopped talking, and the whispering continued for a few seconds before trailing off. I ran. I don't even remember how long I ran. My legs ached, my lungs burned. I tripped more than once, skinning my hands and knees on the rocky trail. I kept going. When I finally saw the dirt road and my car through the trees, I almost cried. I fumbled the keys out of my pocket with shaking hands, got the door open, and slammed it behind me. But before I started the car, I looked back at the tree line. There was something standing there, too far to see details, but tall, lean, watching. I didn't wait. I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and tore down that road faster than I should have. Even now, I don't know what followed me, human or something else. I told my friend about it later, and he seemed genuinely disturbed. He said that part of their land had always been strange, that hunters avoided it, said the woods felt wrong. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press him. I haven't been back to those woods since. I won't even drive near that area anymore. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear footsteps outside my window. Soft, careful, like someone doesn't want to be heard. I never look. I don't want to know if something followed me home. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I've always been the kind of person who enjoys solitude. There's something peaceful about being alone, especially in nature. The endless sky, the quiet hum of insects, the rustle of leaves. There's a clarity in those moments, a stillness that allows me to clear my head and reflect. That's why I decided to take a solo trip into the woods one spring. I had researched the area well, a remote national forest in the mountains where few people ventured. The sort of place where you could disappear for days without seeing another soul. I wasn't a novice to hiking or camping. Far from it. I had all the gear, a map, and a compass, and I planned out a route that would take me on a loop through the wilderness for 5 days. I made sure to leave my car at the trailhead, checked in at the ranger station, and headed off with nothing but my pack, tent, and the desire for peace. The first day was everything I expected. The air was crisp, the trail empty, and the woods quiet, save for the occasional bird call and the sound of my boots crunching over pine needles. By mid-afternoon, I had set up camp by a creek, nestled between 2 large boulders. I had a fire going, and as the sun dipped below the tree line, I sat back, enjoying the solitude, the crackling of the fire, and the whisper of the wind in the trees. That night, I lay in my tent, the warmth from the fire still lingering in the cool air outside. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches overhead. I could hear animals moving in the distance, deer, maybe a raccoon, but nothing that felt threatening. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the familiar sounds of the woods. It was in the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from my sleep. The night was cold, and I found myself shivering in my sleeping bag. Then I heard it. Something moving outside my tent. I froze, holding my breath. At first, I thought it was an animal, a bear, maybe, or a deer. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't the usual soft thud of paws or the rustling of leaves. This sound was deliberate, slow, almost like footsteps. My heart began to race. I reached for my flashlight, my hands shaking slightly. I knew I shouldn't be afraid. It was probably just a person out for a walk, or someone else camping nearby. But the forest felt too empty, too quiet for that. I held my breath again, listening. The footsteps circled my tent. It was as if whatever it was walking around, pausing every now and then continuing again. It was methodical, not erratic like the movements of an animal. I listened for a long time, my mind racing with possibilities, but the footsteps eventually faded away into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that, but the morning light eventually crept into my tent, and I convinced myself it had just been my imagination. Or maybe it had been an animal, after all. I packed up camp quickly, eager to leave the unsettling feeling behind, and continued on my hike, determined to enjoy the rest of my trip. The next 2 days were uneventful, but the strange feeling from that first night lingered in the back of my mind. I kept thinking about the footsteps, wondering if I'd heard them correctly. The woods were silent, save for the occasional bird call, but that silence now felt heavy, as if something was waiting. On the third day, I veered off my planned route to explore a small side trail that caught my eye. It was overgrown, barely visible through the dense foliage, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed it, weaving through the trees and underbrush until I came across a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a pile of rocks. At first, I thought it was a natural formation, but as I drew closer, I realized it had been deliberately stacked, a crude structure of uneven stones. It was strange, unsettling even. The rocks were placed carefully, but they seemed almost too intentional. The air around them felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite explain. I hesitated, then knelt down to inspect the pile more closely. As I did, something caught my eye, a small, weathered object partially buried in the dirt next to the stones. I reached for it, pulling it from the earth with some effort. It was a knife. The handle was old and worn, the metal of the blades scratched and tarnished. My first thought was that it must have been left behind by another hiker, maybe years ago. But there was something about it that felt wrong. The knife wasn't something you'd leave behind casually. It felt intentional, like it had been placed there for a reason. I stood up quickly, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Something about the rocks and the knife disturbed me, and I decided it was best to leave the clearing behind. I turned back toward the trail, eager to get away from whatever this place was. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My footsteps seemed too loud, too echoing in the stillness. I glanced over my shoulder several times, but there was nothing there. Just trees and the distant sound of wind rustling through the leaves. That night, I set up camp farther down the trail, away from the strange clearing. I made sure to keep the fire burning bright and tried to focus on the crackling wood, on the normalcy of the moment. But again, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time the wind picked up, every time a twig snapped in the distance, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. As the night wore on, I finally managed to fall asleep, but I woke up again, not long after, with the same sense of unease I had felt on the first night. This time, however, there was no mistaking it. There was something out there. Something moving. The footsteps were back. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the thin fabric of the tent, trying to see anything. Nothing. I could hear it, though, slow, deliberate steps moving around my tent, just like before. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever, or whatever, was out there. It wasn't an animal. I waited, my mind racing with possibilities. Should I call for help? Was it another camper? But the trail was supposed to be empty. There was no one else around. I had passed the last trailhead hours ago. This wasn't supposed to be a popular area, and yet the footsteps continued. I stayed completely still, listening as the footsteps circled my tent, each step heavier than the last. And then, just as I thought they would fade away, the sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. Then came a soft thud against the side of my tent. I gasped, my blood running cold. It was as if something had knocked into the fabric, and I could feel the pressure from the outside. I held my breath, my eyes wide in the dark. Then another thud. This time, louder. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my backpack, unzipped the tent, and bolted into the night without looking back. The woods were pitch black, and I could hear nothing but my own frantic breathing as I ran. The flashlight was useless in my trembling hands, the beam shaking wildly as I tried to navigate the underbrush. I ran and ran until I couldn't breathe, my legs aching, my mind clouded with panic. I didn't stop until I found the main trail again, panting, exhausted, and terrified. I kept walking, never stopping, until I reached the nearest ranger station hours later. I didn't tell them everything, how I had found the knife, the strange rocks, the footsteps in the night. I just said I had gotten lost and wanted to get out of the woods. They looked at me with concern, but I insisted I was fine. I never went back to those woods. Never told anyone about what had happened, about the rocks, the footsteps, or the feeling that something was watching me. Maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. But as I left the ranger station and drove back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there in the woods, it was still waiting, watching, and it would be waiting if I ever decided to return. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The woods were always a place I found comfort in. I've never been one for crowds or the constant noise of the city. There was something about the stillness of nature that grounded me, calmed me. That's why, when I had the chance to take a week off from work and escape the chaos, I chose to go camping alone in a remote part of the forest. It was a place I'd heard about from an old friend. He'd been there once, a secluded part of the woods where few people ventured. The sort of place where you could disappear and truly get away from everything. I wasn't worried about being alone. I had camped in remote places before. I'd taken trips into the backcountry with just a backpack, a tent, and the hope of finding solitude. I figured this would be no different. A quiet week to recharge my mind and get back to myself. I made my plans, packed up my gear, and drove out to the forest, ready for a peaceful getaway. The drive to the trailhead was long but beautiful. The road wound through small towns and then gave way to the dense trees of the forest. The farther I went, the less traffic I encountered. It was a peaceful, almost surreal drive. The sound of the car tires on the gravel road was the only thing that interrupted the silence. I reached the trailhead in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip low, casting long shadows over the forest floor. I parked my car, grabbed my pack, and started down the trail. It wasn't an easy hike. The path was rough and overgrown in places, but I was used to it. I had done my research and knew where I was headed. The plan was to camp at a small clearing near a creek about 6 miles in. I had mapped the area and estimated it would take me a few hours to get there. As the trail stretched out before me, I felt the familiar sense of peace that only being deep in the woods could bring. The air was fresh, clean, tinged with the scent of pine and earth. The only sounds were the calls of birds overhead and the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. I didn't hurry. I was in no rush. I paused here and there to admire the scenery, to breathe in the silence. By the time I reached the clearing, it was dusk. The sun had just sunk behind the trees, leaving the sky painted in soft hues of purple and orange. I set up my tent quickly, gathered firewood, and started a small fire. As I sat beside it, I felt the familiar comfort of being alone, surrounded by nothing but the forest and the sounds of the night. It was peaceful. I could hear the creek gently babbling in the distance and the occasional hoot of an owl from somewhere deep in the trees. I ate my dinner, cleaned up, and then sat back to enjoy the evening. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the dark air. It was calm. Almost too calm. I didn't realize it at first, but there was something strange about the silence. Usually in the woods at night, you hear all sorts of sounds, animals scurrying about, the wind rustling through the leaves, insects chirping. But there was none of that here. It was as if everything had fallen utterly still. I brushed off the thought. Maybe it was just the remoteness of the place. Perhaps there wasn't as much wildlife here as I was used to. But as the night deepened and the fire flickered lower, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't a feeling I could put my finger on, just a sense that something wasn't quite right. I tried to shake it off and crawled into my tent to get some rest. The night was cold, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones, but I was used to it. I zipped up my sleeping bag, curled up, and tried to fall asleep. But the silence outside was so deep, so unnerving, that sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing the occasional snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves. It could have been an animal, I told myself. Maybe it was just the wind. But each sound, each movement in the darkness seemed deliberate, too calculated. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what had caused me to wake, but something felt wrong. I lay still for a moment, listening. There was nothing, no wind, no rustling, no distant calls from animals, just silence. Then, faintly, I heard something else. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe I had been dreaming, but then the sound came again. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps moving through the underbrush. The sound was far too distinct to be an animal. Someone was out there. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps came closer, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wasn't sure if it was another hiker or if something else was going on, but the idea of being out here, alone, with someone or something, moving through the woods made my blood run cold. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, shining it through the thin fabric of the tent. There was nothing out there. I could hear the footsteps clearly now, though, and they were coming closer, slow and steady, as if whoever it was circling my campsite. I sat still, holding my breath, watching the faint outline of the tent wall as the light from my flashlight shook slightly in my hand. I waited for what felt like hours, though it was likely only a few minutes. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, unsure of what to do. I told myself it was probably just another camper, someone lost or out for a midnight hike, but something told me that wasn't the case. The silence that followed felt wrong, too wrong. Then, suddenly, a loud knock sounded against the side of my tent. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the soft patter of an animal or the wind. Someone had knocked on my tent. I froze, too terrified to move. Whoever or whatever was out there knew I was in here. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the darkness around me oppressive. The sound of my own breathing seemed deafening. After a few minutes, I gathered the courage to slowly unzip the tent. I reached for my pack, grabbed my knife, and held it tightly in my hand. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I wasn't about to let myself be caught off guard. I slowly pushed the tent open, trying to make as little noise as possible. There was nothing outside. The campfire had burned down to embers, and the woods were as still as ever. I stood there, waiting, listening. The silence stretched on for several minutes before I decided it was safe to move. I couldn't stay there. Whoever or whatever had been out there, I couldn't be sure, but I wasn't taking any chances. I packed up my tent as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my pack, and started to move back toward the trailhead. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still out there, watching me. The moon had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was eerily quiet as I made my way back down the trail, my flashlight flickering in the dark. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. The night was unnervingly still, and every crack of a twig beneath my feet seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted, my legs aching, my heart still pounding. I didn't even bother to look around. I just threw my pack in the car, slammed the door, and drove off as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone what happened out there, not even the ranger at the station when I passed it on my way back home. I didn't know how to explain what had happened or if anyone would believe me. Maybe it had been some other hiker. Maybe I had imagined it all. But I knew, deep down, that whatever it wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. I never went back to those woods. And I never will. Story the end.
Story number 10.
I had always been the type of person who valued solitude. When most people got stressed or overwhelmed by life, they sought friends or family, maybe a therapist or a vacation. Me, I just needed space, away from everyone and everything. The woods were the perfect escape. There's something calming about being surrounded by nature. The stillness, the sounds of birds and the wind rustling through trees, the crisp air. Everything made me feel more centered. But that was before I experienced what I did in those woods. It started with a weekend camping trip I'd planned for myself. I'd been working nonstop for weeks, deadlines, meetings, emails, just the typical grind. I needed a break. So I decided to pack up my gear, grab a few essentials, and head into the backwoods of northern Michigan, where I could truly disconnect. The area I chose was known for its isolation, which was exactly what I was after. It wasn't a popular camping spot, which I liked, but it was still marked on maps, so I figured it wouldn't be too dangerous. At least, I didn't think it would be. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, parked my car at the edge of the woods, and made my way onto the trail with nothing more than a backpack and my camping gear. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold, with just the right amount of sunshine peeking through the canopy of trees above. As I walked further into the woods, the sounds of the world outside slowly faded away, replaced by the calming rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. The air smelled fresh and clean, and I took a deep breath, appreciating the peace that settled over me. After about an hour of hiking, I found a perfect spot by a small stream. There was a clearing, large enough for me to set up my tent and campfire. I wasted no time setting up camp, getting my tent staked down, my campfire prepared, and my stove set up for dinner. The evening passed quietly. I made a simple meal, read a book by the fire, and stared up at the stars. It felt like I was finally at peace. Nightfall came quickly, as it often does in the woods, and I crawled into my tent, feeling the warmth of the sleeping bags surround me. The wind outside was light, just enough to cause the branches to sway gently. It was a peaceful night, the kind that lulls you to sleep without a care in the world. I woke up around 2 in the morning. Something wasn't right. At first, I couldn't place it, just a feeling of unease, a twinge in the back of my mind that something was off. But I ignored it, rolled over, and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it, a rustling. Not the wind. No, this was something else, something moving through the underbrush. It was close enough that I could hear twigs snapping, leaves crunching underfoot. I froze, straining my ears. I didn't move a muscle, not wanting to alert whatever was out there to my presence. The sounds didn't stop, though. It was getting closer. I listened for a moment longer, hoping it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. But then I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. Footsteps, not the soft, scurrying steps of an animal, but the deliberate, heavy footsteps of someone walking. Someone, human. My pulse quickened. I was in the middle of nowhere, hours away from the nearest town. Who else would be out here at this hour? My mind raced. I thought about getting up and looking outside, but the idea of exposing myself to whatever was out there terrified me. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, praying the noise would go away. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, circling my tent. Around and around they went, making no attempt to hide their presence. I could hear them clearly now, each step a distinct crunch, followed by a brief pause, then more footsteps. The sound was methodical. It wasn't frantic or rushed. Whoever or whatever was outside wasn't in a hurry. It almost felt like they were watching, waiting. I didn't dare move. I just kept my eyes locked on the zipper of the tent, barely able to see in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else. Was it gone? I waited for what felt like an eternity. Every sound amplified in the silence. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, too quiet to make out, but unmistakable. I almost couldn't breathe. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. Whoever was out there was not only close, but they were watching me. They knew I was in that tent, and they were trying to communicate somehow, trying to scare me. I had no idea how long it had been since they first started walking around my camp, but it felt like hours. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, wide-eyed and terrified, clutching my knife, listening to every little sound that came from outside. The next morning, I cautiously unzipped the tent, my nerves on edge. The sun had risen, casting an eerie glow through the trees, but the forest around me was still silent, as if it were holding its breath. I stepped outside, half expecting to find someone standing there, waiting for me. But there was nothing. No sign of anyone. The ground was undisturbed, the only marks in the dirt being those made by my boots the day before. I should have packed up and left. I knew that, but something in me wanted to stay, to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining things, that I could handle whatever had happened. So I stayed. I spent the rest of the day walking around, gathering firewood, trying to get my mind off what had happened the night before. The day passed without incident, and I even found myself starting to relax again. That evening, I made another campfire, roasted some food, and sat there staring into the flames. But as the night drew closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong again. The woods had turned unnervingly quiet. No sounds of birds, no wind rustling in the leaves, just nothing. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just on edge. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, I knew something was coming. It started with the same rustling noise from the night before, distant but unmistakable. The footsteps. I froze, unable to move, unable to even think. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was circling my camp again. This time I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight, flicked it on, and scrambled to unzip the tent, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped outside, the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the clearing. Nothing. I looked around, my breath coming in quick gasps, but there was no sign of anyone, no footprints, no movement, just the silent trees surrounding me. I felt a mixture of confusion and fear. Who had been walking around my camp? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to leave right then and there, but another part of me couldn't bring myself to. It was like I was trapped in some twisted game I didn't understand. I stayed up that night, my flashlight never leaving my side. I didn't want to take any chances. But the night passed without further incident. The next morning, I packed up quickly, packed everything away, and left. I didn't even stop to look around, not once. I just kept walking, my heart racing, trying to get back to the car as fast as I could. But as I hiked out of the woods, something caught my eye. A symbol carved into a tree, a circle, with a line through it. It was exactly like the ones I had seen the night before. And then I realized something. I wasn't alone. Story the end.